Cahn. I have 5 weeks here at Nomura. I joined, having left the civil service earlier this year, and I come to this wonderful building, and we welcome you here. George Osborne came and opened it about 3 weeks ago. He made the joke that the last Chancellor Exchequer to come here, to come and open a building for us, found himself Prime Minister at the end of the day. But didn't happen for George Osborne. We welcome policy exchange with a topic which seems particularly timely, shaping the policy agenda. Let me say a word about Nomura, and then just a word about what we're going to talk about. Nomura is, of course, a Japanese bank. We have 27,000 people worldwide, based in Tokyo, but Nomura bought the Lehman European operations when Barclays bought the American ones, and we're now a major player here in London. We have 3,500 people in this building. We're a major inward investor in this country, and indeed committing ourselves with a 20-year lease on this building shows our commitment to London as the European financial centre. We try in Nomura to be a good participant in the City of London. Part of that is trying to get political debates and trying to make our contribution to public discussion. And that's why we welcome Policy Exchange, welcome Neil O'Brien here today. I just want to throw out 2 thoughts before the panel start talking. The first is that issues and policy issues are more important than ever. One of the great differences over my career as a civil servant is that when I started in 1973, you could tell pretty certainly where each party would be on a policy issue and where each politician would be. It feels very different now. Really, even before we had a coalition, it was difficult to predict exactly where a particular political party would end up on a particular issue. So I throw out the idea that the term right and left has lost some of its salience over the last few decades. The other thing I'd throw out to you is that we've had a period of periods of stasis and then periods of radical change. And the periods of radical change seem to have been getting more and more frequent. When I was a schoolboy, I remember waving Mao's little red book and believing that cultural revolution and constant revolution was the order of the day. And that was, of course, because I wanted to rebel against what was happening in my own country. The oddity is that we seem to have become the place where there is a constant change in structures, in systems, in policies. And the paradox I throw out to you is that it doesn't seem to be what the people want. So why is it that politicians believe that constant reform is the way to win elections? Leaving that thought with you, I hand over to Neil to say how are we going to shape the policy agenda running up to the next election. Neil.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to this session on shaping the political agenda ahead of the next election. I should start by thanking you to Andrew very much for hosting us this in an almost impossibly chic environment. It's a wonderful, wonderful place. We're going to be talking about where we think the political agenda is, where it's going next, and the kind of work that we are doing at Policy Exchange. My colleagues are going to give you a quick kind of whistle-stop tour of all of their respective specialist areas. So I'm going to start by giving you a kind of overview and talking about some of the kind of cross-cutting themes that this government is pursuing. At the end, we're going to have some time for questions and answers, so please do all think of really horrible questions to stump my colleagues. And I also have the pleasure at the start of reading out the hashtag for this event. So for all of you who want to Twitter, the hashtag is PX2015. For all of you who don't Twitter, you can feel suitably baffled about what all this is. As I think will probably become apparent, I think that this is a really interesting time and a very good time to be running a think tank. There are already all kinds of different processes running, working towards the next election. Firstly, you have Oliver Letwin, who in the policy unit is running a review of 10 different areas for the second half of this Parliament. Secondly, you have the so-called Coalition 2.0 Committee, which is a group of 6 Liberal Democrats and 6 Conservatives, looking to try and identify the areas where the coalition agreement will have been exhausted and already implemented by the second half of the Parliament, and thinking about the areas where there might be scope for further common agreements, and that will become, I think, increasingly important after the AV referendum result. Next, of course, the party is already starting to appoint people to draft their manifestos for the election. And also, while each party obviously individually will be thinking about its own offering, so for example, the Liberal Democrats have their own policy unit, which is quite separate from the central coalition policy unit. In Labour, there is, of course, a policy review going on. So far, that's been quite quiet because it's early days still yet. Miliband has said that he sees Labour Party policy as a blank sheet of paper, which is, of course, music to the ear of think tankers like us. And actually, at the moment, quite a lot of the most interesting things on the Labour side are actually happening outside that formal process. Developments like the discussion about blue Labour, things that kind of James Pennell and John Cruddas are talking about. And in fact, because I think that's interesting, we're organising a session on that pretty soon with all the main players at Policy Exchange, so please do come along to that event. But for the coalition, the key question is there still going to be a sense of progress and a sense of common shared goals in the second half of this Parliament? So let me talk about some of the key themes where I think there is scope for the two parties to agree and make further progress. So one of them is the big society. We've heard a lot about that. And the government now, I think, is relatively clear after a lot of initial confusion about what the big society is. Three themes there. One is about opening up public services, another one is about localism, and another one is about encouraging voluntarism in civil society. And on public services, progress is being made. You have workforce modernisation in the police. You have the first ever privatisation of an existing prison. You have free schools and academies. You have some progress in health. Of course, there is now a pause for reflection, and that's all up in the air. And you have some progress on mutuals too, particularly in social work, though it's yet to be clear to me whether we're going to see really serious numbers of mutuals and if the government can come up with a model that will allow that idea to go to scale. Also, a lot of interesting things happening in terms of public service reform through payment by results. So the work programme is a big increase on the last government's flexible New Deal. We have the interesting experiment in Peterborough where you have payment by results to try and reduce reoffending by ex-prisoners. Very interesting pilot. And I know that there is interesting thinking going on within Downing Street about the future of payment by results as effectively a kind of whole new way of doing government. People thinking about its application to new areas, perhaps payment by results for drug treatment or for early years education or for the care system or even for what are called problem families. But this is really quite a new way of running government. It's not just delivering a service anymore which you run yourself. Effectively, government is in charge of regulating a competitive market, which is quite a new thing. And I think there are a lot of interesting questions still to be answered about how payment by results will be taken forward. What happens, for example, when payment by results systems overlap? If you're paying one group of people to reduce unemployment and then another group of people to try and deal with problem families, who gets paid if there is a successful result at the end of that? So interesting questions there. On localism, perhaps a little less progress. You could say that reforms like the Free Schools programme, perhaps elected police commissioners, assuming that still happens, they are localist reforms, but there have been relatively few new powers for local government. There is an interesting reform of the planning system, and a lot of that is still up for discussion, though at the moment, as it's currently constituted, we're not really looking at the kind of revolution in our planning system that we would personally like to see. And on voluntarism, this is perhaps the most interesting, innovative, but also difficult to do part of the big society. The government is doing a number of things. There was the Giving White Paper on encouraging philanthropy. There is the Big Society Bank, which is being set up. But it is very difficult to increase the overall level of voluntarism in our society. If you look at the DCLG produces a poll every year of how many people are volunteering, and it's completely flat for the last 12 years. So can government move the numbers on this? We are very interested in this. We have Robert Putnam, who's probably the world's expert on all this, coming to speak at Policy Exchange soon. So again, please, if you're interested in this, do join us for that discussion. Second big cross-cutting theme is about the impact of the information age on government. Government is not really in many ways in the information age yet. Francis Maud used to talk a lot about the post-bureaucratic age. which I guess we don't hear so much about anymore. Perhaps we're in the post bureaucratic age, and I can see that it's not an ideal thing to be talking about with voters down in Neasden, but nonetheless, I mean these issues about how government responds to the information age are not going to go away. And in fact, Policy Exchange on Monday is going to be setting up a new unit to deal with digital government. And I think there are a whole set of interrelated questions there. I mean, the first is about the digital delivery of public services. Huge potential to make government much cheaper and more effective. So, for example, to process someone's benefit claim online costs 1/100th of what it does to do it in the traditional manner. Huge potential for savings there, but it does raise interesting questions about government's ability to deliver big ICT projects, famously difficult. There's a second set of difficult issues about the use of data. Government could save a lot of money if it mashed up and brought together all the different data sets it has. It could save a lot of money if it used private sector data to get better at identifying the drivers of demand and segmenting its customers. For example, at DWP, we could find out what someone's barriers to work are by looking at data from the health service, or in the health service, we could look at doing things about public health by identifying populations with particular problems. But again, there are big ethical and political questions about mashing up this data. Interesting questions about privacy, about data confidentiality. Oliver Letwin makes the point that, in the past, government were the only people in our society that held all the data. Actually, these days, thanks to the information revolution, increasingly the private sector has better data than the government. But there is still a kind of reflex within central government to be very skeptical about using private sector data. Recently, the government have just employed a guy called Tim Kelsey, who's very interesting on all these subjects. Some of you may have read one of his articles entitled "Long Live the Database State," which gives you an idea of where he's coming from. So there's a lot of thinking about all these things going on in Downing Street. At one end of the spectrum, you have a rather trendy discussion about online activism and the potential for all these technologies to improve our democracy. The hope that government will dump data onto the web and civic geeks will come along and use that to, the new transparency will drive down costs and identify waste in central government. Very exciting agenda. At the other, much harder end of the spectrum, you have a lot of interesting questions becoming more important about cybersecurity. I mean, that's national security. We're in the kind of age of Stuxnet. A minister was telling me the other day, that Chinese students every day try and push over a very big part of the government's IT, and it's not for, it's not an attack on Britain. It is just, students, practicing and doing something very destructive. So big questions for national security, but also big questions for corporates as well. Are our mobile phones going to be secure? Government can lose data, but then it turns out so can Sony. Interesting, important questions. And behind all those questions, obviously more fundamental ones, is about digital infrastructure. The government's promised, for example, to give everyone in the country fast broadband by the end of the next parliament, and it's interesting to see how we're going to deliver that. So a big and important new agenda and something that we're going to be looking at Policy Exchange. My last big cross-cutting theme is really about something related, which is public sector efficiency in the future of the civil service. My impression from talking to ministers and SPADs after a year of this government is there is a lot of chafing and sort of dissatisfaction about the way the machine works. A lot of people complaining, saying, my private office doesn't turn around letters for a couple of months. It's a disaster. Now, I think some of these problems are really about the relationship between the political tier and the civil service. But some of them are about the way the state itself works. So the government are trying to make the civil service more effective, more flexible. And that's why you've got, in today's papers, lots of stuff about George Osborne trying to reform pensions, redundancy, TUPE, and things like that. It's very important. But there are much bigger questions about what the state should and shouldn't be doing fundamentally. What can be outsourced from the state and delivered more effectively by the private sector. That's something we think about in all of our different issue areas. And about a year ago, there was a kind of interesting debate among the think tank community. Would the pressure on the government, the fiscal pressure, cause there to be more innovation in public services or less innovation? And I think, looking back at the first year of this government, my verdict on that would be more innovation. Even if you just look at something like, say, the police, you can see how they have responded to pressure on their budgets by doing innovations that should have happened years ago. So, for example, my friend in the police for the first time now has a BlackBerry, so we have less paperwork. We have organisational change so that very expensive salaried officers aren't cleaning cars. We have a civilian doing that much more cheaply. for this first time, if you're a Londoner, you'll have noticed that Sir Paul Stephenson has police in London now patrolling individually. So we're getting twice as many patrols for the same amount of money. So all these innovations are happening. And for that reason, the reason of fiscal pressure, the fact that you've got a coalition that's just interested in new ideas, this is one of the most fruitful times to be talking about policy, to be running a think tank in the last 30 years. A very exciting time. Many of you in this room have interesting ideas and insights from your own businesses. We are very keen to continue the conversation with all of you and to involve you in our work. So I do hope if you're new to Policy Exchange that you will get in touch with us after this event and arrange to come and meet us and talk about what we're doing. So enough from me. We have lots of new ideas. I'm now going to start handing you over to the first in our series of specialists, appropriately, the only man who is breaking our strict no-ties policy at Policy Exchange, our head of financial policy, Guy Fraser-Sampson. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neil. Yes, perhaps I could introduce myself just very quickly. I've had what might unkindly be described as a checkered career in that I've done quite a few different things. I have actually run a transaction team within an investment bank, though not one nearly as large as this one. I've been an institutional investor with the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, and I've also been an investment manager. I ran for about 7 years the international operations of an American fund manager based in Mayfair. And currently, in addition to my newfound responsibilities as head of financial policy with Policy Exchange, I still find time to teach a number of postgraduate modules at Cass Business School here in the City of London. And in fact, I apologize in advance if I have to slip away before the end, but believe it or not, I do have a lecture room full of MBA students waiting for me at 2 o'clock. Now, in the financial area, we will be looking to shape the debate in a number of key areas. And by the way, I would echo what Neil said. We would love to hear from you people about any of this. So please do come forward and let us have your ideas. So I'd like to touch very quickly, I think, on 2 or 3 areas. The first one is fairly obvious because it's in the public arena already, and that is the question of banking regulation. And for those of you who are not in the banking industry, I should perhaps explain very quickly that historically, attempts to control the banking environment have taken one of 3 different forms. The first is what you might call separation, and the best known example of that is probably the Glass-Steagall Act in America, which came into force in 1933 and stayed on the statute book until it was repealed by the Clinton administration. And what that did was it forbade commercial banks from conducting investment banking activities, and of course vice versa. The second approach was one of what you might call oversight and supervision by bodies such as the FSA. And of course, we here in the UK have had a wonderful opportunity at first hand to see just what a great idea that was. And by the way, I should mention that Beatrice, who's with us from the FSA today, did clear that gratuitous remark in advance. Then the third approach is one which seems to be becoming increasingly prevalent. You have it, for example, under the various Basel Accords, is what you might call capital adequacy. And what that does is it imposes certain minimum capital ratios in respect of different types of assets and liabilities on banks' balance sheets. Now, we don't yet have a final report from the Vickers Commission. That will come, we are told, in September. But we do have an interim report, and I think it's fairly clear from that what the broad thrust of the final recommendations are going to be, because consultation now is invited on how those recommendations can be put into effect and briefly to what extent, but not really any longer on what is to be proposed. And what Vickers seem to be going for is a combination of 2 of those approaches. Firstly, this horrible new word, subsidiarization, whereby it's proposed that the retail activities of a bank be hived off into a separate subsidiary and ring-fenced. And secondly, capital adequacy, in that, at least in respect of that retail banking subsidiary, the very highest capital requirements of Basel III, which currently seem to stand at about 10%, would be imposed. Now, clearly, we would like to be out there in due course with some sort of measured and considered response to interim Vickers. But I would like to give you one issue to take away and perhaps think about, and a fairly obvious one which arises, and that is the extent to which banking regulation should be international or the extent to which it should operate at a domestic level. And if indeed it is to be international, then on what basis? Is that to be done by some form of international agreement, or is it to be under the aegis of some sort of international body? And if so, which one, and where, and how? So banking regulation, I think, a fairly obvious one for us to be looking at. We'd also like to be out there on a couple of other issues which are in the public arena for different reasons. The first one, I think most obviously, is financial remuneration, which I'm guessing is a subject fairly close to the hearts of many people in this room. And that arises, I suppose, as a result of Dodd-Frank in the United States, but also various initiatives which are rumored in Brussels. And I think, again, if you want an issue to take away and think about on that one, I think there are two separate points here. The first is, to what extent does one agree with the broad thrust, the principle of what something like Dodd-Frank is trying to do? And the second is, even if you do, to what extent is it really practical to implement? And if you have a chance to read it, you will see, for example, that they wish to discourage excessive risk-taking. That is a very, very difficult thing to define. Even if one was to look at a traditionally high risk, or something which is viewed as high risk area of investment, such as private equity, if you had a buyout manager on the one hand, they would be horrified at the thought of losing all their capital on one transaction. That would be an awful tragedy. Whereas if you were, for example, a venture capitalist, you would regard that as an ordinary part of everyday life. So how does one define excessive risk-taking? And I think the third point, which I'd like to touch on before I hand over, is the field of derivative instruments, which of course again is out there in the public arena as a result of various initiatives proposed by Brussels. And I think the issue I'd like you to take away on this one is the way in which one should look at that. Broadly, what Brussels seem to be doing is they are looking at regulating derivatives on the basis of what they are, rather than how they are used. And I think it would be analogous to having a situation where you were concerned perhaps that children were from time to time being attacked by dogs. Do you ban dogs, or do you seek to identify and control rogue dog owners? And I think that's one issue which perhaps the people looking at this in Brussels haven't yet fully thought through. So, I've been brief. Those are just three issues. We are actually going to be looking at a wide range, but as I said, we would very much invite your proposals on the sort of things that are concerning you in the field of financial policy. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, and good afternoon. I'm Matt Oakley, and I head up the Economics and Social Policy Unit. As you might have guessed, economics and social policy covers a pretty wide range of areas. To mention a few, we're looking at planning reform, fostering, welfare reform. You might have seen public sector pay in the news this week, youth unemployment, infrastructure, and growth policy. A wide range of areas, no time to talk about all of them today, but we're going to be doing work in the next year. So I'm going to focus today on just two, on growth and welfare. Now, clearly with my interests, I'm biased, but I think that these are two of the main areas where there's going to be huge battlegrounds in the next election. All parties have pledged that their choice of policies over deficit reduction, their economic policy, and welfare reform will ensure that the country gets growing again and that they will create jobs and prosperity. Only two parties, however, have actually had a chance to test their ideas. But if they fail, if growth does not return to the UK economy and unemployment remains high, we are left considering what the consequences will be for the coalition and also the result of the next election. So what's been announced so far? On welfare, universal credit will be introduced from 2013. It will replace a large portion of the current tax credit and benefit system and will make the current system more simple and increase the gains to work. As well as this, the work programme is currently being rolled out. This is the coalition's main attempt to provide employment support for the long-term unemployed and disadvantaged. Both of these areas are very high-stakes areas for the coalition. To take one example, the work programme is a huge experiment with payment by results, as Neil was saying. If that fails, if they don't get the results that we're after, if unemployment doesn't fall, and we can really quite easily measure those outcomes, then that puts into question the future for outsourcing in other parts of the public sector. Looking more particularly at worklessness, both the policies I mentioned, universal credit and the work programme, are the flagship policies for reducing worklessness in the UK. But there's real questions about how far it would actually go. The new system won't be that simple. It won't change financial incentives that much. And previous experience has shown us that moving the hard to help, as the label hard to help might suggest, is very, very hard to do. So, real concerns, and those aren't the only ones. There are also huge concerns over IT. Any significant delays in implementing universal credit, which, from my experience in the Treasury, despite the government saying it's not a major IT programme, it really is, any significant delays will push most of the reform into the next Parliament, meaning that no voters will really see any change to the welfare system until the next Parliament. With these concerns in mind, the real question is whether the reforms will be enough to really start to make an indent in the 3.9 million workers' households we have in the UK at the moment. I'd argue that at the moment, the action of the government suggests not. We saw today a large announcement by the Prime Minister on youth unemployment, announcing more money. If the coalition was really confident that its reforms were going to really make a dent in unemployment, would that extra money be needed now? At Policy Exchange, we also see potential for reforms to the work programme, perhaps renegotiation further down the line, a change in contracts, and at Job Centre Plus, where they could be given new powers and tools for helping people get back to work. We will be guiding this thinking and really taking forward the agenda to kind of push the government in these areas. You'll see that most recently in the next 2 weeks, where we'll publish a report proposing a new direction for welfare reform. Our reforms would require more of individuals to get, in order for them to get benefits. It would increase the length of time people spend searching for work and make the consequences of not doing so tougher. We also want to make sure that people who have contributed to the system see more of the benefits of that contribution in what they get from benefits and pensions. The contributory principle has been eroded over time, but we want to re-establish closer links between what people put in and what they get out. In short, our policy will be about reintroducing self-reliance at the centre of the welfare system, while protecting the most vulnerable and providing intensive support they need. Interestingly, this is also what the British public think. You may have seen recently that a Policy Exchange report covered the results of a poll which we issued. The British public believe the benefits are too generous, that the rewards to work are not limiting the amount of people moving off unemployment, and that tougher conditions on benefit claimants and sanctions were needed. These points were true across voters from all parties. And it's also interesting to see that this is where the opposition are positioning themselves. Recent speeches by Miliband, by Byrne and by Balls all talk about personal responsibility and requiring more of people. With the left taking this ground, unless the coalition moves further this way very, very quickly, there's a real chance they'll be outflanked in the race to become the party, or the group of parties, ready to take a firm stance on welfare dependency. This makes our work massively topical. Moving away from welfare and onto growth, but staying with the theme of personal responsibility. The last few decades have seen a creeping of government from both a national and local level into areas previously controlled by individuals and firms. Regulations and planning rules are constricting the growth of business. Enterprise is being stifled, and business complains of a lack of skilled workers. Now, the government certainly can't be criticised for its lack of rhetoric in this area. It is attempting to drive growth with the introduction of enterprise zones and to move towards deregulation for small firms and making some small planning reforms. However, we are arguing that this isn't enough, and I think one question really explains why. If areas classed as enterprise zones will benefit from the policies within them and grow because of them, and small firms will benefit and are more likely to succeed and take on more workers if they're deregulated, then why is the whole of the UK not an enterprise zone, and why is deregulation not happening more widely across all firms of all sizes? We argue that this sort of approach, a pulling back of government, is the way forward. The government must stop trying to drive growth and instead look to allow business and individuals to do what they've always done, to innovate, build, develop, and create growth in a dynamic economy. This would mean government stepping back, removing itself from business decisions in the majority of cases, and relying on the skills of the UK economy. It will also mean a stronger role for business and for individuals in driving the direction of the UK economy. Thankfully, our work's already making inroads. Our recent recommendations to make it easier to change empty commercial property into housing are being consulted upon. This is a small measure, but would allow reforms which would actually bring forward more housing supply, controlling housing prices, and allow local areas to be regenerated. We're also going to be publishing soon a report explaining how we can unleash the growth potential of our towns and cities, freeing them from regulation and centrally controlled planning system that constricts their growth. We'll outline the new attitude towards growth is needed at both a national and local level. Overall, on growth and welfare and across all the areas that my unit touches upon, our work is about 4 things. First of all, shifting responsibility from the state to individuals. Secondly, freeing up business and workers to really direct the growth in the economy. Thirdly, and as a result of these 2 things, delivering real increases in prosperity and living standards across the UK. Finally, to do that, we also need to ensure that those individuals and local areas with the greatest needs are given the support they need to really engage with the rest of society. These will be the key areas that we're working on, and I know they're also the key areas that the government will be thinking about and the opposition thinking about as it comes up to the next election. So look forward to engaging with you all and watch this space for our publications.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And it's good to see so many of you here today. My name is James Groves. I head up the education work at Policy Exchange, and it's no surprise, it'll be no news to all of you to recognise that the pace of reform within education policy over the past 12 months has been pretty furiously going ahead. Admittedly, there's been their fair share of turbulence along the way, yet it's clear the landscape is shifting. To take just one example, we now are in a position today where about 1/3 of all secondary schools in the country are either an academy or are becoming an academy. That's quite a move from where we were this time last year. Much of the early thinking behind many of these shifts first, of course, saw the light of day at Policy Exchange, and we take great pride in that. So freeing up of the academy programme, the free school concept, the pupil premium, a more targeted skills policy based on apprenticeships, a more level playing field for private providers and higher education. I want today to look briefly at 2 areas that I feel the government can take education policy over the course of this Parliament and into the next. 2 areas where we at Policy Exchange are currently looking at. And in both these areas, I feel that the government can realistically push the boundaries and consolidate their reform agenda. First of all, turning to higher education, the current higher education landscape is a long way from resembling the free market that many had hoped we were on the cusp of just 12 months ago. So given that the government is certainly for the course of this Parliament and into the next, likely to retain a strong role in managing the higher education system, we feel it should take the opportunity to encourage changes in the culture of English higher education, introducing as much flexibility and choice for students as possible. Particularly, we feel that further education colleges have a critical role to play in this regard. Although they have always been involved in providing higher education, their role to date has never sufficiently been defined nor clearly enough supported. We don't feel that such an ill-defined role is by any means inevitable, and as we'll point out in our report, which is due to come out shortly, if you look to places if you look to America, and indeed if you even look north of the border to Scotland, you can see how the governments in those places give a more clear and defined role and political support to the equivalent of further education colleges. So overall, that this means widening our awareness of higher education offerings and having a broader appreciation of what higher education is, giving foundation degrees and HNDs greater status, as well as focusing more on higher level apprenticeships and increasing their visibility. It also means that higher education for higher education to expand, it should be doing so independently of universities. The government are already making moves this way, but we believe they could go further. And we will argue in our report that there could be specific benefits in doing so, giving the government room to actually expand the overall number of students and enhance social mobility. So there's been criticism in recent times of the government's intention to allow private universities whose students will now be able to receive loans of up to £6,000 to stay outside of the student quota system. And equally, just this very week, there was a lot of rebuke for the possibility that the government might allow wealthy students to fund their own places and stay out of the numbers game. In both instances, the government's commitment to social mobility is threatened. So, therefore, why not, we would argue, make the exception in exactly that area where you stand the most to gain in terms of social mobility? In other words, treating short vocational related courses separately from traditional higher education, with courses being cheaper and considerable numbers of them being paid for by individuals or employers. Such a move might give the government the opportunity to expand this valuable area. And indeed, as many of those who undertake many of those courses come from backgrounds with low participation rates, it helps the social mobility agenda at the same time. Secondly, a quick look at schools policy. Much has already changed, as I've alluded to at the beginning, in terms of the landscape on our schools over the past year. And I believe the number of academies will increase as this Parliament goes on, and indeed the number of free schools. But these positive developments to expand in this way can only be scaled up, as far as from where I'm standing. They can only be scaled up and made to operate more efficiently and effectively if we accept a more significant and formal role for the private sector. We can no longer afford to shy away from the general philosophy of the private sector and profit making when it comes to our schools. Why are there special conditions for schooling when there is a clear private sector involvement in other areas such as health and welfare? The picture is already less black and white than some of us might imagine, and we are working on this, a report on this at the moment. Our schools are technically allowed to make profits in terms of the surpluses that they keep. Private making companies have already been commissioned to operate teacher training facilities and to deliver all school improvement programmes. With local authorities dwindling, we'll increasingly see schools selling services to other schools. Private companies can make profits in nursery education, special needs education, in further and higher education. So we feel that the government needs to take this forward and basically say it's time for mainstream school education to catch up. Why is this important? Well, it'll be no surprise that that sanctioning a profit motive would provide the turbo fuel that's needed for the Free Schools project. There's estimated to be only around 17 of those opening this September. Now, of course, it's only an initiative that is in its first year. It will need time to bed in and for others to see good examples of it working. But undoubtedly, a profit motive would take this to heights that we can only imagine at the moment. And undoubtedly, I feel a profit motive as well would also shatter any likelihood that the Free Schools initiative will become the preserve of the middle classes. Furthermore, I think that by allowing private companies to manage and run federations of schools and academies, another area which we feel is very, very relevant and needs to be pushed, by allowing private companies to do that, it will encourage more schools to opt for the benefits of academy status and thus really allowing the government's concept to take a firm root. Just to close, it's definitely fair to say that union opposition has been fervent over this past year, and it's undoubtedly going to continue to be the case for the rest of this Parliament. Its capacity to destabilise reform shouldn't be underestimated. As such, it's just as critical as it is for government to focus on more reforms. They're going to have to do a better job in getting a clear message across. So they must encapsulate their direction of travel in terms that students, parents and teachers can understand, and ensure that their policies stick coherently to that message. And furthermore, following on just from Matt, they need to weave the narrative of education reform more deeply into the broader skills and economic agenda message. Thank you.
My name is Simon Less, and I head Environment and Energy at Policy Exchange. The overall approach of my unit can be reasonably well summed up in these two words: greener, cheaper. In other words, it's about achieving more on environmental outcomes, but doing so at lower economic costs. Now, following some of my unit's previous reports' recommendations, the government has introduced the Green Deal, has increased its focus on building infrastructure, and in particular the Green Investment Bank. And in the spending review and recent budget, the Treasury scaled back some of the most expensive subsidies for particular technologies, has strengthened or begun to strengthen the carbon pricing framework, and has promised to put in place a better framework for controlling the policy levies through energy bills. And these are all areas picked up in our reports, Greener, Cheaper and Green Bills last year. Now, turning to the next few years, I'm going to talk about two areas. The first is the climate policy's impact on energy markets, and the second is water policy. Now, the current direction on climate and energy policy is pretty similar to the direction that the previous Labour administration took, which means, unfortunately, that in many areas there will be higher costs to decreasing carbon emissions than is necessary, or less carbon reduction than could have been achieved with the same resources. Now, I think what leads to this is three things. Picking winners. The policy is particularly aimed at deploying renewables in the short term, which are in the short term very expensive, perhaps costing £150 to save a tonne of carbon compared to £15 under the emissions trading system. Secondly, complexity of policy and layering of many different policies. This means that the government has to take a whole range of decisions on an ongoing basis. That leads to meddling in policy, it leads to regulatory uncertainty. We've seen this recently in a number of changes to the feed-in tariff scheme, to the carbon reduction commitment, and this all drives costs higher. And the third driver is that the policy direction is rolling back competitive markets in the energy sector. The recent electricity market reform proposals, part of them on so-called contracts for differences, are a major step towards this. And we published a report in this area last year again called Remonopolising Power. Now, is this direction likely to change during the rest of this Parliament? Well, I think it depends. It depends on which vision within government wins out. And I'm going to crudely characterise the first, perhaps a bit unfairly, the first vision as DEX, which involves central planning, or move towards central planning, stronger targets for renewables, and the second vision as being perhaps more associated with the Treasury, and that's a focus on markets, on a neutral carbon pricing framework to steer those markets, and on rolling back some of the most expensive and wasteful subsidy policies. The second thing that whether or not we get a change of direction depends on, I think, is whether we have a policy crunch at some point in the next 4 years. Now, this could be as a result of energy prices and the fact that particularly renewables policy is going to add a lot to energy prices. It might come because it becomes clear that the renewable energy target, which drives so much of policy, it cannot be met in the UK. And I think policy over the next 4 years also depends on whether DEC decides it's too difficult and too risky for it to take on central planning of the electricity market, and whether a different direction is taken. And I'm going to move on to talk about water. Now, water is a neglected area by comparison with what I just talked about, but it is in the coalition agreement. The issues in water include current high levels of over-abstraction of water across England and Wales, and under current arrangements, estimated costs of dealing with that of billions of pounds, and at the current rate of dealing with it, it could take up to centuries to deal with. There's also issues of rising water scarcity. This is driven by population growth, potentially by rainfall pattern changes from climate change, and by increasing costs of supplying water at peak scarcity, so that we're starting to build desalination plants at very high cost. Possible policies in this area include more metering, particularly smart metering, more structured tariffs for water customers, as well as opening up the market for water supply, and in particular having competing water retail service companies, an area where Scotland has led the way, and also more trading between water companies. Now, all of these policies are politically controversial, and there are debates going on within government at the moment about them in the run-up to a water white paper expected towards the end of this year. So in terms of our upcoming reports, we'll be publishing 2 reports on water, how to make it cheaper to deal with the problem of over-abstraction, and the case for having separated water retail service companies. There'll also be a report on simplifying and making more effective policy for driving energy efficiency for businesses and other organizations, particularly what's to be done about the CRC energy efficiency commitment, and also what's to be done about the multitude of different carbon prices that affect different parts of the economy. Depending on what sort of business you are or what sort of fuel we're talking about, the carbon price can vary by an order of magnitude. And in terms of new research areas that I would like to open up, I'd like to cover low carbon innovation, both the resourcing of low carbon innovation, what should be the balance between resourcing the deployment of existing near market technologies and supporting more innovation on technologies that will help us to get to 2050 decarbonisation. I'd also would like to do work on shale gas, possibly the biggest external change to happen in energy policy globally in the last few years, but with some huge unknowns. How big will it be? What are the environmental consequences of shale gas? And I'd like to be able to look at the different possible scenarios and whether policy is in the right place to respond to whichever of those scenarios comes to pass. And finally, biodiversity is, I think, an interesting and area that's coming up in the UK and Europe, as well as globally. And I'd like to look at issues, the feasibility and design of biodiversity banking, and how we can get better value from the billions that are spent through the Common Agricultural Policy on agri-environment schemes, which are an important part of this picture. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is David Skelton. I'm Deputy Director and Head of Research. This afternoon, I'll be talking about Policy Exchange's work around health policy. Looking back almost a year to the day to the 2010 general election, it was really notable how little health was mentioned. It's probably one of the only general elections for the past 40 years where health wasn't a major issue. Health, so often an Achilles heel for the Conservatives, had been effectively neutralised as a political issue. There was the promise to ring-fence health funding, a promise for no further top-down reform, and a successful wooing of the medical professions meant that health was effectively taken off the political agenda. The public and professional disenchantment with the previous government's healthcare reforms also narrowed the gap between the two parties, so that the polling that showed who the public trusted most with the NHS, the Labour lead had gone from an enormous lead about 10 years ago to single figures at the last election. Well, if health wasn't a major issue at the last election, it's certainly going to be a major issue at the next election. The recent row over the government's proposed reforms to healthcare has brought the issue of health right back to political centre stage, and that is where it's going to stay until 2015. Between now and the next election, the Conservatives will have to try and reassure voters that the NHS is still safe in their hands. You saw that this week with David Cameron saying the Conservative Party was the party of the NHS, both to the 1922 committee and to a variety of television interviews. The Liberal Democrats, despite being initially in favour of the GP commissioning reforms, will have to show and reassure their base that they've done something to water the reforms down. And Labour will also need to develop a more coherent policy on the NHS, as there is little prospect of year-on-year large increases in health funding, and Labour will also have to reconcile the Blairite wing of policy with an idea of choice, with the other wing of more of an element of centralising and top-down reform. This makes framing the debate about healthcare all the more important. At Policy Exchange, we believe that policy on the NHS should be driven by 4 key elements. Firstly, health and social care should be patient-focused. Second, emphasis should be placed upon prevention and improving public health. Third, in an environment of public spending restraint, the NHS does need to be more productive. And finally, we believe that a variety of providers and increasing competition and contestability will improve patient care. It's on these foundations that Policy Exchange has influenced the coalition in a number of health and social care policies. They're too numerous to list, but a few of these policies we've influenced include giving GPs budgets to commission care, a review of alcohol tax to tackle binge drinking while not harming responsible drinkers, incentivising GPs to work in disadvantaged areas, and measuring NHS success on health outcomes such as improving cancer and stroke survival rates. It was also based on these principles that our recently released and highly praised report about GP commissioning suggests that the government was going down the right road with GP commissioning, but was going down that road far too quickly. We recommended that any rush to implement the healthcare reforms and abolish PCTs too quickly could undermine moves to reform healthcare. We've argued that the reforms could deliver real and lasting transformative change, but in order to do so, it is crucial to win GP and public support on the way. In the period between now and the next election, the proposed reforms will dominate debate, at least in the short term. And by the time of the next election, it is likely at least some form of the reforms will be in place. As well as GP commissioning, we believe there are a number of other areas of health and social policy that will be part of the emerging debate. These issues will include developing an effective model of integrated care to develop a real patient focus and ensure that health and social care work together to benefit the patient. In the next few months, Policy Exchange plans to publish a report on this issue. We believe that politicians should consider moving away from a one-size-fits-all approach towards a landscape where a variety of models of integrated healthcare can exist alongside GP consortia and NHS hospitals. At the same time, personalised care and further use of self-care will move further up the agenda. The further use of information technology will play a major part of this, and our newly launched digital government unit that Neil mentioned before will be looking at how this can happen. Finally, improving public health will be an issue that remains high on the NHS agenda. Tobacco use, poor diet and lack of physical exercise contribute to heart disease, type 2 diabetes, lung disease and cancer, which have a massive impact on the NHS budget. Delivering effective, evidence-based public health policy will be one of the major challenges for the coming years. Health will be a major political and policy issue for the next election. Already the policy agenda is becoming clear, with all political parties understanding the centrality of health for the next general election. Thank you very much.
Afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I just wanted to take a quick canter through crime and justice, where we are now, where policy seems to be going, and lastly, where we might end up in 2015 and what the main issues there will be. Firstly, the big picture, crime is still falling. There's no clear consensus on whether that will continue. And as we've seen before with previous recessions, there is usually an uptick in crime and a recession time lag as well. But this recession is different, so we'll have to wait and see. What we do know is that demand on the criminal justice system is still high. Prison population is high and still rising, despite the ambition to reduce it. And of course, the demands on the police are still there and will increase in the short term with the public order pressures on them through protests and the Olympics next year. In the short term, the government's focused on reducing cost and trying to reduce some of that demand. So the Ministry of Justice is bringing forward sentencing changes which, to deliver on some of the savings, are necessary, but they're certainly not uncontroversial. The problem with sentencing changes, unlike most things in government, is that you take all the heat for doing it in the very short term, and any of the gains are probably there for your successor. The sentencing bill itself, if it happens in this session, won't deliver any changes for 18 months. The government are, however, pressing ahead with police workforce reform to try and modernise police working arrangements and reduce some costs there. On this issue, where we've argued for many years that the reforms are necessary to modernise the pay of police officers, I think they have a fair wind behind them. Unlike in the 1990s, when the Prime Minister was in the Home Office, when the Sheehy report was being debated, I think the public are in a different place on this issue now and do see the need for reform. The quaintly called IR problem, as officials refer to it, the industrial relations problem in crime and justice, Police Federation, Prison Officers Association, seems for the moment to have receded. The privatisation of Birmingham Prison was a potential flashpoint, but that never materialised. In terms of the other short-term pressure, the obviously reduction in police budgets will mean lost officer posts. As a note of caution, we would suggest it's probably much less than people suggest. Perhaps over 4 years, 10,000 officer posts lost, which would still leave us with more police than we had in 2004. However, there is a recognition in Downing Street that the crime narrative has gone wrong. If anyone was watching the House of Lords yesterday, they'll have noted that the policy on police commissioners may have gone wrong as well. But the Prime Minister's speech next month is designed to be the first attempt to try and wrest the agenda back. But the issue really will be the policy, not the words. The criminal justice system, under pressure of budget reductions, will be getting smaller. My concern is to see whether the system can get a bit leaner and smarter at the same time. There's a lot of discussion about moving from inputs to outputs, so we'll have fewer police and fewer prisoners, but will we have less reoffending? A move from the centre to the local, with the Home Office doing less, and local police forces doing more, an emphasis on transparency with crime maps. We'd like to see that go further. And criminal justice efficiency, a much neglected area. Everyone's obsessed with stages 1 and 4, the police and prisons, and nobody pays much attention to prosecution in the courts. So we're looking to do more work in those areas as well. As we see it, the big issues in 2015 then, one thing I haven't mentioned, human rights. We've done a major report into this issue, but the issues around parliamentary sovereignty and the role of the Strasbourg court are not going away. There's some looming cases there which would concern any minister. Coalition tensions, I think, on that will persist, and there could be a flashpoint at some point. If crime rises towards the end of the Parliament, I think there'll be some serious questions about the coalition's policies and whether or not they've in any way contributed to that. Difficult to prove, though it will be. And there'll be some question marks about some of these flagship policies. If the metric is now the outcome of reducing crime through reducing reoffending, something it's very hard to do, will Ken Clarke's rehabilitation revolution have delivered in time? For us, the concern is really no longer about being tough or soft on crime, it's about being smart on crime. We did a report recently on community sentences, one of the most common sentences handed out by the courts. We found that actually, if you look at the best practice in England already, the community sentences that are shorter, more intensive, and more about visible, unpaid work in the community for a public benefit, they seem more punitive, it seems more tough, but actually the record shows that they're also the most successful at reducing reoffending, and they cost less. So the question is, how can we be smarter on crime? Because we certainly don't have enough money anymore to spend on doing just more of it. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so a lot going on, to summarise. We now have a bit of time for some questions and answers. I'm sure that you will have lots of them. So because we've only got about sort of 15 minutes, we might try and take them in groups of 2 or 3. If you want to ask questions, just stick your hand up. And you'll also find that there are handily microphones in the seats in front of you. You just have to pick them up and press the button. So do we have any first questions? It'd be helpful if you can say who you are and where you're from, and also who you'd like to answer your question. David. If you want to, there's no roving mic, there's just a microphone in the seat in front of you. Or you can shout.
This is really in the education sphere. There was no mention of early years education, and it seems to me this is an area of education that has been downgraded in coalition policy. Would you comment?
Okay, so if there's any other questions at the moment, we'll take a couple together. There's a lady just a couple ahead of you.
I wondered if the Policy Exchange are doing any work on the reformation of the EU budget. There are very clear red lines that the government has drawn about what they are prepared to not move on, where they might be prepared to move on, and one of those is there is no more money. So how do we do better for the same money, if not actually slightly less?
Okay, and Lord Duggan in front row.
I think that you dealt with it, it's easier if I start. You dealt with a whole lot of individual policies, but I think the real problem the government's run into, which is something you haven't touched on, is that the legislative programme is overcrowded. We have two big constitutional bills, perhaps a third: reform of the universities, reform of the schools, reform of pensions, reform of the benefits, the police, local government, and the NHS. Now that is an unbelievable legislative programme. There's no sense of prioritisation. The problem arises because the parliamentary timetable is overcrowded, and a number of these measures, some very good, some less so, are ill-prepared and ill-presented, and one sees that in the NHS, one saw that in the case of the universities. So you've dealt with individual policies, it's the totality that's getting screwed up.
Interesting question. Okay, let's take just those three for now. Quickly on early years.
A good question, and one that I didn't raise in my speech. We actually had a round table on this very issue this week with Sarah Tether, and we had about 20 people in the room. And it's clear that the government have published the Claire Tickell's report on early years, and they're also working towards a policy paper later on in the summer, which is one of the reasons why they asked us to convene a round table on it. There was a lot of good soundings from around the table, but one of the things that I took away from that was that there seem to be so many things that work well in early years, and people say this works, this works, this works, but that isn't being delivered nationally, and that isn't being published nationally and made clear enough nationally. So I think, to me, it was very clear that the government need to, basically, if it's as simple as on one sheet of paper saying what works, and making that happen across the country. We spent a lot of time at that meeting talking about payment by results, and I know that's an area that the department and the minister are keen to move into with children's centres. Their big concern, though, is on what those results are, whether they pay people on the processes or they pay them on the outcomes. So, not mentioned in my speech, but I can assure you it's an area that the government are working on and that we have been involved in and will continue to be involved in.
On the European budget, the short answer to that is no, we're not doing work on that. We do touch on European affairs sometimes as and when, particularly in our financial work. I mean, it seems to me that there are interesting things to say about it. Simon mentioned our interesting idea about what we could do with some of the decoupled common agricultural payments. I think there's an interesting agenda. It's been there for the last two rounds of fiscal perspectives, where there's an attempt to move towards more of a budget for growth rather than just spend on regional policies that we know don't work. But again, I'm quite struck that the government's negotiating position is quite status quoist, and it's very much focused around the headline number of the total spent. So I don't know whether anything will happen in that space. And on the Tuggan's point, well, you're the legislative expert because you're there and they're obviously working you very hard. And you're right, I'm sure that some things are in better nick than others in terms of the bills. I suppose the only comment I would have really about that is David Cameron is clearly haunted by the experience of the first Blair administration. He doesn't want to waste time. He wants to get ahead and do lots of things. And that's a good idea. But that is not compatible with also having a light touch centre, I don't think. And I think they've learned that. I mean, a couple of people have written essays about the change in the way the Downing Street operation works. And I still think it's got a long way to go. It still needs to get bigger, stronger, and more political. So I think you're raising a kind of a fair point there. There was a couple more questions. A gentleman there.
I'm interested, we're talking about policy, but we haven't really talked about government. And one of the things that leading on from the last question is that we talk about things like outcomes, commissioning for outcomes, measuring for outcomes, and we're still based on a government that's structured on a report that was delivered in the early part of the last century, where budget and targets are largely allocated on silos by department. Even the setup of today, we talk about functional departments and policy units, and actually those things are entirely incompatible with not just you touched on payment for outcomes, but actually commissioning for outcomes, allocation of budget and resources. The reason the work programme will fail is not because it's a bad idea, it's because worklessness isn't just about work, it's about health, it's about education, it's about homelessness, it's about a whole host of public policy and social policy issues. And I'm just wondering whether there's enough attention being paid to that, or actually what we're trying to do is layer sophisticated attempts to take a new approach to public service delivery onto an industrial age model and that's just entirely incompatible.
Okay, interesting question. Were there any others? I see any other hands up. There's a lady right at the back there.
Can you hear me okay without that?
I think so.
Julia Ross with the Identify. I head up the care and non-track the Identify work with the NHS and the local authorities. I was delighted to hear that you're going to be looking at integrated care models, and I think the time is absolutely right to do that. We've been joining up health and social care data at a patient, person-centred level, but we do struggle with that, or we struggle less with it than the operational side, because there seems to be this obsession in NHS bodies and local authorities with collecting data to feed the national beast, not collecting data, the right data, and then acting on it to run the NHS business or the social care business. And I'm wondering if you'd like to comment on that.
Okay, good question. And was there there's a third, there's a gentleman right over there.
Another question around getting beyond policy silos.
Mm-hmm.
One of the areas where we can be fairly sure of the changing shape of this country is around its demographic profile, which impacts very differently at one end of the age spectrum, where there are fewer children leaving secondary school and entering the labour market, and at the other end, in a negative way, we have issues of increasing pressure on adult social care budgets, but also opportunities thrown up by the end of the default retirement age. Mm-hmm. Are you planning to do any cross-cutting work around that particular theme?
Great question. Okay, so let's try and take these things in order. I thought this point about siloization very interesting. So it applies in lots of different fields. So in, for example, in crime and justice, the last government's approach was to set up these crime and disorder reduction partnerships. So you would try and get all the local agencies, the police, the probation people, the crime prevention people, and so on, to have a meeting and try and coordinate. And that's better than nothing, but it doesn't take you that far. I think one of the things that we've written about and we're interested in, the whole issue of turning police commissioners into justice commissioners who would be a single person elected and responsible for all those fields, is probably a more effective way of getting join-up. But you're right, it's a big unexplored area. If you look at something like dealing with problem families, totally right, it's the work, it's their problems with social workers, it's their lack of skills and education. And the government is thinking, I think, just at the start of thinking about how to create budgets that cut across departments, because no department wants to be the one who pays for this. So I think it's an interesting, vexed question. I'd like to explore it. I think in lots of the different things we do kind of explore that, and we're keen to talk more about it. On the point about health, do you want to?
It was a very, very good point, a very interesting question. As you say, there are a variety of models already of integrated healthcare. But what does astonish me at times is how the lack of integration between health and social care. I've worked in a few PCTs over the past 6 years or so. And there were times where healthcare couldn't even send certain emails to social care without some long, intricate process. Now, that is almost the opposite of integration. I think the fundamental point that I touched upon when I spoke earlier is that integration and all reform should be designed to improve the patient outcomes and improve the patient experience. It shouldn't be designed in a way that gives a huge swathe of data to Whitehall. The correct integration should be the integration which is correct locally, based upon local culture, local needs, and local patient outcomes. And I think that's the way we'll be looking at when we deliver this report over the next few months. But it's a very, very interesting point.
And on the point about demographics and different ages, I think that's a really interesting one. So a lot of our different pieces of work have touched on different aspects of that. So I would plug at this point our Richard Ehrman's piece on demographics that came out a while back. We've been looking at the crisis in school places. We're very interested in building new school places. That's a project we're thinking about doing next. We're doing some work on pensions. And a lot of the work we do in housing and planning, housing obviously central to what David Willits has christened the clash of generations. We had David come and speak about his brilliant book, The Pinch, which I would recommend to all of you as well, which I think is an important piece of work. But no, we're not doing an overview piece of these questions that brings everything together in the way that Mr. Willits did. But I think it would be a very interesting thing to do. So if you know of anyone who's keen to sponsor something like that, then get in touch. I think, I'm afraid, we are out of time already. I do know that in a moment I'm just going to hand over to Sandru to say a few words to close. There is still, I think, coffee outside, so please do hang around and do continue the conversation. Please do speak to our heads of unit, and also do email if you've got ideas about things we should be doing, things to look at, things you know about that are interesting. Just get in touch, and let's make this the start of an ongoing relationship. But thank you so much, Nomura, for having us, and Sandru, over to you.
Well, Neil, thank you very much. I'm struck by the fact that we're 1 year in to what the Prime Minister insists will be a 5-year administration. In other words, 4 years till the next election, and yet we're already thinking, Policy Exchange is thinking about what are going to be the issues for the next election. Perhaps that means that we are moving a little bit more to the American model, where you're never far away from an election and politics is even more dominant. Certainly we in Nomura are very conscious that it's all change in our area, and absolutely fascinated by what Policy Exchange have to say. Thank you very much. Thank you to everybody for coming. Nomura has been really very proud to host this event. And as Neil said, there is coffee. I think there's even a bit of refreshment. So do stay, do network, do talk further, and do continue to read what everything Policy Exchange has to say.